The HOA lawyer thought he could destroy my family over a garage full of my late father's tools, until I bought his office building and handed him an eviction notice. Picture this: me, standing in my perfectly organized garage, holding legal papers that would make this fancy attorney homeless. The same garage that 6 months earlier was packed floor to ceiling with my dad's woodworking equipment. Every saw, every chisel, every hand plane he'd collected over 40 years of craftsmanship. My footsteps echoed through that lawyer's empty office suite as I personally delivered his 30-day notice. The irony was so thick you could cut it with one of Dad's old chisels. These people thought they could bully a grieving son into abandoning his father's legacy. They had no idea who they were messing with. What would you do if some fancy lawyer tried to steal your family's last connection to a loved one? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know if HOAs are this corrupt everywhere. My name's Jake Morrison, and 6 months ago my world got turned upside down when my father dropped dead of a massive heart attack right there in his workshop. Dad was 68, built like a brick house, and could outwork guys half his age. One minute he was hand-sanding a jewelry box for my mom's birthday, the next minute he was gone. I'm 45, been an electrician and contractor for over 20 years, but nothing prepared me for walking into that garage after the funeral. It smelled like sawdust and dreams. $50,000 worth of professional woodworking tools collected over 4 decades. Table saws, band saws, hand planes that cost more than my truck payment, chisels sharp enough to split a hair. Dad's workshop wasn't just storage, it was a cathedral to craftsmanship. I inherited the house in Pinewood Estates, this upper-middle-class subdivision built back in 1995, with strict HOA covenants and residents who think a dandelion in your lawn is a crime against humanity. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and enough petty rules to choke a horse. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to settle Dad's estate, working electrical contracts remotely while figuring out what to do with his life's work. That's when I met Margaret Thornfield. Picture a 62-year-old woman who looks like she stepped out of a country club catalog. Pearl necklace, perfectly styled silver hair, and a white Lexus that probably cost more than most people make in a year. Maggie, as she insisted I call her, was the HOA president and former real estate agent. She had that fake smile that never reached her eyes, and manicured nails that she loved tapping on her clipboard. Day 3 after I moved in, there she was at my front door, clipboard in hand, pearl necklace catching the morning sunlight like a warning beacon. "Mr. Morrison," she said, not waiting for an invitation to peek around me toward the garage. "I'm here about a covenant violation. No storage of commercial equipment in residential garages." I explained that these weren't commercial tools. They were my father's personal collection, inherited property that meant everything to my family. "Rules are rules," she replied, those manicured nails drumming against her clipboard like a woodpecker with an attitude problem. "You have 30 days to comply or face fines." But here's what really got my attention: the way her eyes lingered on Dad's vintage table saw, calculating its value like she was appraising inventory. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics. This was about opportunity. I spent the next week researching those HOA covenants, and guess what? The clause was more ambiguous than a politician's campaign promise. It mentioned commercial operations, not equipment storage. So I visited 3 neighbors, and they all admitted the same thing. Maggie had a history of selective enforcement that would make a corrupt cop blush. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, the elderly widow next door, pulled me aside one afternoon while watering her roses. The scent of those flowers mixed with the lingering garage smell on my clothes as she whispered, "She forced the Johnson family out last year over a fence that was 6 inches too tall." Funny thing is, Maggie's realtor friend bought their house the next week. That's when it hit me like a sledgehammer to the skull. This wasn't about rules, regulations, or community standards. This was about power and profit. Maggie Thornfield had turned our neighborhood HOA into her personal ATM machine, and my father's garage full of valuable tools looked like her next withdrawal. The garage door still creaked the same way it had when I was 12 years old. Dad never did fix that hinge. But now that familiar sound felt different. It wasn't just a reminder of childhood. It was a battle cry. These people thought they could steamroll a grieving son into abandoning his father's legacy. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Day 28, after Maggie's little visit, a certified letter landed in my mailbox like a grenade with a bow on it. $500 in fines plus $100 a day for continuing violation. I called the HOA office, and Janet Simmons, Maggie's secretary and professional bootlicker, claimed Maggie was unavailable. Right, unavailable like a politician during tax season. By day 35, the fines had ballooned to $1,200, and they were threatening to slap a lien on Dad's house. That's when my doorbell started buzzing, at 7 in the morning like an angry wasp. Process server. Nothing says good morning like getting sued before your first cup of coffee. But here's the thing about being an electrician for 20 years. You learn to read blueprints. And HOA covenants are just legal blueprints written by lawyers who charge by the comma. I spent 3 days photographing everything: garage organization, tool serial numbers, inheritance documentation with time stamps that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Then I hit the county courthouse and dug into those HOA incorporation documents like an archaeologist hunting treasure. And wouldn't you know it, buried in Section 14, subsection C, was a beautiful little exemption for inherited personal property stored in orderly fashion. Time for some reorganization therapy. I spent the next weekend turning Dad's garage into something that would make a Snap-on tool catalog jealous. Every tool mounted on pegboards with military precision, hand planes arranged by size like a symphonic crescendo. I even epoxy painted the floor so shiny you could use it as a mirror to check your teeth. Legal nugget: always photograph evidence before disputes escalate. 10 zones and metadata can make or break your case in court. I took professional photos that would make a real estate photographer jealous, then sent Maggie a certified response citing the exact covenant exemption. Checkmate, lady. That's when things got interesting. 3 days later, there's Maggie at my door again, but this time she brought backup. Janet was there, looking like a nervous chihuahua, and behind them stood a man in a suit that probably cost more than my truck. Italian leather shoes that could feed a family of 4. Cologne thick enough to choke a rhinoceros, and the kind of confidence that only comes from billing $300 an hour. "Mr. Morrison," the stranger said, extending a hand that had never touched a callus in its life. "Rick Caldwell, attorney representing the Pinewood Estates HOA. Caldwell looked at my garage setup and chuckled like I'd just shown him a crayon drawing. "Your interpretation of the covenants is creative but incorrect. We're prepared to file suit for covenant violation and legal fees." The smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the honest scent of sawdust and wood stain felt wrong, like putting ketchup on a perfectly grilled steak. This guy didn't belong in a space where real work happened. But here's what really caught my attention. While Caldwell was busy being condescending, he was also taking photos of my house exterior and making notes on a legal pad. And I heard Maggie whisper to Janet, "The market's hot. This lot could go for $850 easy." Suddenly everything clicked into place like a perfectly fitted joint. They didn't want compliance, they wanted me gone. This wasn't about neighborhood standards, it was about real estate speculation with a legal twist. Caldwell dropped his business card on Dad's workbench like he was doing me a favor. "Think carefully about your next move, Mr. Morrison. Legal fees add up quickly and we have deeper pockets than you do." After they left, I stood in that garage, listening to the familiar creak of the door Dad never fixed, and something crystallized in my mind. These people thought they could intimidate me with fancy lawyers and expensive suits. They thought a working-class electrician would roll over and play dead when threatened with legal action. They thought wrong. I picked up Caldwell's business card and noticed something interesting. The address was downtown prime real estate territory. A quick Google search revealed his law firm rented a suite in the Meridian building, a beautiful 1,920s structure that had been converted to professional offices. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was worried about their lawsuit. I had right on my side and documentation to prove it. I couldn't sleep because an idea was forming, crazy and audacious enough that Dad would have either laughed his ass off or called me certifiably insane. Maybe both. The garage door creaked one more time as I closed it, and I swear I could hear Dad's voice in that familiar sound. "If you're gonna fight, son, fight smart." Game on, Maggie. Game on. 2 weeks later, the real lawsuit hit like a freight train loaded with legal bullshit. $25,000 in claim damages plus attorney fees. Apparently my dad's tools were somehow causing irreparable harm to the neighborhood's property values. The local newspaper picked up the story with a headline that made me look like public enemy number 1. HOA battles, homeowner over garage violations. My photo looked like a criminal mugshot, and the newspaper ink stained my fingers black as I read the biased article that painted me as some kind of hoarder disturbing the peace. Within hours, 3 contractors I regularly worked with received anonymous complaints about my licensing. Funny how those complaints all used the same legal terminology that Caldwell loved to throw around. Time to lawyer up. I hired Sarah Mitchell, a young attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and had a reputation for making pompous board presidents cry. She reviewed Caldwell's lawsuit and actually laughed out loud, a genuine belly laugh that echoed through her office. "Jake, this is frivolous as a $3 bill. They're fishing for settlement money because they know they can't prove actual damages." She leaned back in her chair, grinning like she'd just found a 20 in an old coat pocket. "Let's give them something real to worry about." Legal nugget: HOAs can't sue for damages without proving actual monetary loss. Emotional distress over seeing tools doesn't count. The key is documented evidence that actual property values decrease due to specific actions. Sarah filed a countersuit for harassment, seeking legal fees and punitive damages that would make Maggie's pearl necklace rattle. She also moved to dismiss their case, including my covenant exemption research, as evidence. That's when the discovery process started, and boy did we discover some interesting things. The HOA's legal bills for the past year? $15,000, every penny paid to Caldwell's firm. Maggie's husband owned a property management company that specialized in, wait for it, handling foreclosed HOA properties. The smell of corruption was stronger than the diesel fumes from my work truck. Sarah's printer worked overtime, churning out discovery documents like a paper mill with a quota to meet. We found a pattern that would make a mob accountant proud. 8 homeowners forced out over the past 3 years. All their properties resold above market value through a network of friendly realtors. The settlement offer arrived on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and bad decisions. Drop the countersuit, pay $5,000, and move my tools off the property. Sarah's advice was crystal clear. "They're scared, Jake. People don't offer settlements when they think they're going to win." But I kept digging deeper into those city planning documents, following paper trails like a bloodhound with a law degree. That's when I found the smoking gun. Original HOA filing documents that contained a critical error. Their covenant enforcement powers were more limited than a mall cop's jurisdiction. Legal nugget: HOA power isn't unlimited. They must operate within their original charter, and filing errors can invalidate years of enforcement actions. I declined their settlement offer like it was a 3-week-old fish sandwich. The case moved toward trial, and that's when the dirty tricks really started. A serious anonymous complaint to the city about my home electrical work. Apparently someone thought my wiring was dangerous. The city inspector showed up looking confused and found nothing wrong. He admitted the complaint was unusually detailed for someone who supposedly just happened to be walking by. Time for some insurance. I installed security cameras around the property, professional-grade stuff that could catch a mouse scratching its nose at 50 yards. Within a week, I had documentation of Maggie's daily drive-bys. That white Lexus of hers started showing up like clockwork, cruising past my house like a shark circling wounded prey. The woman was obsessed. Caldwell filed a motion for preliminary injunction to force immediate tool removal, claiming the neighborhood was suffering ongoing aesthetic damage. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I wore my best suit, the one I'd bought for Dad's funeral but never wanted to wear again. Caldwell strutted into that courtroom like he owned the place, expensive briefcase gleaming under the fluorescent lights, putting on a show for the judge about community standards and property values. His performance was more theatrical than a soap opera death scene. Sarah's response was beautifully simple. She presented the covenant exemption, my orderly garage photos, and asked one devastating question. "Your Honor, how exactly do neatly organized inherited tools in a closed garage damage property values when nobody can see them?" Judge denied the injunction faster than you can say frivolous lawsuit. I watched Caldwell's jaw muscles tighten like over-torqued bolts as the gavel came down. But I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. That building address on Caldwell's business card kept rattling around in my brain like a loose screw in a toolbox. Some ideas start small and grow into something beautiful, like a tiny acorn becoming a mighty oak tree. Or in this case, like a small-town electrician becoming a downtown landlord. The city received another anonymous complaint, this time about my work truck being parked on the street overnight. Apparently, commercial vehicles were disturbing the residential aesthetic. I swear, these people had more complaints than a restaurant with food poisoning. Then came the emergency HOA board meeting. $2,500 per household for a legal defense fund to fight my frivolous countersuit. My neighbors started crossing the street to avoid me like I had some contagious disease called standing up for yourself. The smell of fear was thicker than morning fog on a lake. Caldwell wasn't finished either. He filed a motion for preliminary injunction to force immediate tool removal, claiming my garage was causing ongoing aesthetic and psychological damage to the community. The audacity of this guy could power a small city. But while Caldwell was busy filing paperwork, Sarah was doing some detective work that would make Sherlock Holmes proud. She discovered something interesting. Caldwell's fancy law firm didn't own their office building. They rented space like any other tenant. My electrician network is better than the FBI when it comes to local intelligence. Within days, I learned the building owner was an elderly gentleman named Frank Garrison who wanted to retire and move to Florida to be closer to his grandkids. Sometimes the universe aligns like planets during an eclipse. But I approached Frank privately at his favorite coffee shop, a little place downtown that smelled like fresh grounds and opportunity. He was asking $1.2 million for the building, but seemed motivated to close quickly for cash. Financial nugget: commercial real estate often sells below market when owners are motivated by personal circumstances rather than profit maximization. Time-sensitive sellers create opportunity for prepared buyers. The master plan started forming like frost on a windshield, slow at first, then all at once. I liquidated most of Dad's tool collection, keeping only the pieces with sentimental value. That vintage table saw Maggie had been eyeballing sold to a collector in Chicago for $15,000. The complete set of Stanley hand planes, another $10,000 to a woodworker in Tennessee. In total, I raised $75,000 in cash, not bad for a hoarder garage. Getting a commercial loan with Dad's house as collateral and my construction business assets took some convincing, but banks love customers who show up with solid credit, cash down payment, and a viable business plan. The leather scent of fresh loan documents was sharp contrast to the familiar wood aroma of Dad's garage, but it smelled like victory. Sarah structured the purchase through an LLC to maintain anonymity. Always smart to keep your cards close to your chest when you're playing against cheaters. The court hearing on Caldwell's injunction motion was pure theater. I sat in that courtroom wearing my best suit, watching him perform like he was auditioning for a legal drama. Expensive briefcase props, dramatic gestures, voice modulation that would make a radio announcer jealous. Sarah's counter-argument was elegantly simple. She presented the covenant exemption evidence, my garage photo showing perfect organization, and Dad's inheritance documentation. Your Honor, plaintiff hasn't demonstrated any actual harm, let alone irreparable harm. Judge denied the injunction with the kind of finality that makes gavels famous. Watching Caldwell's confident expression crumble was more satisfying than a perfectly fitted electrical connection. Building purchase closed on a Wednesday morning that smelled like rain and redemption. Caldwell's firm had 6 months remaining on their current lease, but here's the beautiful part. The lease included a month-to-month clause after expiration, and guess who was paying below market rent? $8,500 a month when comparable suites were going for $12,000. Business nugget: owning your opponent's office space shifts every power dynamic. Suddenly you control their overhead, lease terms, and business continuity. I spent that evening reviewing the tenant list and building records in my new property. That's when I discovered something that made everything click into place like a perfect puzzle piece. The building's previous owner wasn't just some random seller. It was Maggie's ex-husband from a messy divorce 3 years ago. Divorce records showed Maggie had tried to claim the building in their settlement and failed. The bitterness in those court documents was thicker than winter molasses. Suddenly, this whole HOA fight made perfect sense. This wasn't about covenant enforcement or neighborhood standards. This was Maggie's revenge war, fought by proxy through legal intimidation and property manipulation. She couldn't get the building in her divorce, so she was going to make damn sure she controlled who got pushed out of the neighborhood it anchored. I stood in the empty building lobby that night, my footsteps echoing off marble floors, and laughed until my sides hurt. The sound bounced off the walls like auditory poetic justice. These people thought they were playing checkers while I was setting up a chessboard. They wanted to use legal pressure to force me out? Fine. Let's see how they handle the pressure when I control their lawyer's office lease. Dad always said if you're gonna fight, fight smart. I could practically hear his voice echoing in those empty corridors, approving of the strategy taking shape. The building came with basement storage that the previous owner never bothered to clear out. Boxes and filing cabinets filled with decades of forgotten paperwork. The kind of stuff people leave behind when they're eager to escape bad memories. I was down there checking the electrical systems when curiosity got the better of me. Those cardboard boxes yielded secrets like an archaeological dig. Old HOA correspondence, financial records from Maggie's real estate days, and a manila folder that made my electrician's hands shake with excitement. Original Pinewood Estates marketing materials from 1995, promising flexible covenant enforcement and homeowner-friendly policies. The documents were yellowed with age, but the implications were crystal clear. Sarah nearly dropped her coffee when I showed her the marketing materials. "Jake, this is a legal bombshell. The HOA's current enforcement practices violate the original sales promises made to every homeowner." Legal nugget. False advertising in property sales can void later contract enforcement. If buyers relied on specific promises, those promises become legally binding obligations. Courts hate bait-and-switch tactics, especially in real estate. There was Maggie's signature on the marketing brochures, clear as day, right next to her real estate license number. She'd been the selling agent who promised flexibility while building a fortress of rigid enforcement. The hypocrisy was so thick you could spread it on toast. But the financial revelations were even juicier. Building purchase records showed Caldwell's rent was suspiciously below market. $8,500 versus $12,000, typical for comparable suites. His lease included a personal services clause where legal work was provided at discount rates in exchange for reduced rent. A sweetheart deal that smelled fishier than a week-old tuna sandwich. Property management records revealed Maggie's husband had bought 3 foreclosed HOA properties at auction over the past 2 years. The pattern was clear as a bell. Selective enforcement targeting vulnerable homeowners, forced sales through legal pressure, then swooping in to buy properties below market value. It was a beautiful scam, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Now I controlled Caldwell's office space and lease terms. I had discovery documents proving years of covenant manipulation, and those marketing materials provided grounds for a class action suit that could bankrupt the current HOA board. The power dynamic had shifted like tectonic plates during an earthquake. I scheduled a building inspection and discovered Caldwell's suite had unpermitted modifications. Walls moved, electrical work done without permits, fire code violations that would make a safety inspector's eyes water. The compliance cost? $45,000 minimum. Business nugget. Building ownership includes enforcement of all applicable codes and ordinances. Tenants must comply with regulations or face lease termination. The trap was set with the precision of a Swiss watch. I instructed building management to send Caldwell a formal compliance notice with a 30-day deadline, exactly the same pressure tactic they'd used against me. Poetic justice tastes sweeter than honey from a hive you built yourself. Sarah prepared the class action suit using those newly discovered marketing materials. 12 former homeowners eager to join as plaintiffs, each with documented stories of selective enforcement and financial pressure. The potential damages were climbing toward $2 million. Meanwhile, I started building a criminal harassment case that would make prosecutors salivate. Security footage, documented threats, pattern of behavior, everything needed to put Maggie behind bars where bullies belong. The dusty cardboard boxes in that basement had contained more than forgotten paperwork. They'd contained the keys to Maggie's downfall, carefully preserved by time and her ex-husband's spite. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, darker than midnight in a coal mine. Maggie had spent 3 years trying to control a neighborhood anchored by a building she'd failed to win in divorce court. Now that same building was going to be the instrument of her destruction. Dad always said patience was a virtue, but revenge served cold with legal papers was even better. I'm to assemble the team. Sarah recruited a paralegal who specialized in property fraud cases. A bulldog named Marcus who could sniff out financial irregularities like a bloodhound tracking bacon. My electrician crew volunteered weekend help because they hated corrupt HOAs more than overpriced wire nuts. And Mrs. Dorothy Walsh emerged as our secret intelligence asset, revealing she'd been documenting Maggie's violations for years, like a suburban CIA operative. Coffee shop conversations with neighbors turned into strategy sessions, voices kept low while sharing HOA horror stories that would make Stephen King jealous. The smell of espresso mixed with righteous anger created an intoxicating brew of community solidarity. Sarah explained our multi-pronged attack plan like a general briefing troops before battle. Contract fraud, harassment charges, and potential RICO violations if we could prove the pattern crossed state lines. Legal nugget: RICO applies when patterns of fraud involve multiple parties across state lines. What starts as local HOA corruption can become federal racketeering charges. The key is documenting systematic criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents. Plan A: use building ownership to pressure Caldwell's withdrawal from the case. Plan B: class action suit against the HOA for false marketing, seeking damages for all affected homeowners. Plan C: criminal harassment charges against Maggie for her stalking behavior. Sometimes you need multiple arrows in your quiver when hunting dangerous game. I researched Maggie's property management business deeper than an offshore oil rig, discovering tax irregularities that would make an IRS auditor's heart sing. Property records showed her husband's company bought HOA foreclosures using questionable financing that smelled like money laundering with a real estate twist. Financial nugget: property flipping schemes often involve unreported income and inflated appraisals. The IRS loves investigating sudden wealth without corresponding tax payments. The timeline was damning. HOA enforcement actions correlated perfectly with property acquisition dates, like a criminal's calling card left at every crime scene. My garage sale was actually an intelligence gathering operation, disguised as community bonding. Neighbors shared stories around my kitchen table. Selective enforcement, intimidation tactics, forced sales that destroyed families and dreams. The kitchen table looked like a war room, covered with documents, coffee cups, and righteous fury. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh provided the smoking gun. Photographs of Maggie's own covenant violations. An unpermitted deck that violated setback requirements. An oversized storage shed that blocked sight lines. And commercial signage for her husband's business posted in their front yard. The hypocrisy was so blatant it hurt to look at directly. I installed a professional-grade security system that could document a mosquito's flight pattern at 50 yards. Hidden cameras captured Maggie's daily stalking routine with timestamps, more precise than atomic clocks. Security nugget: stalking documentation requires consistent timestamps and clear video evidence. Modern security systems can provide court-admissible proof of harassment patterns. Always check local recording laws to ensure evidence admissibility. Sarah subpoenaed HOA financial records and discovered over $200,000 in legal fees over 5 years. Enough money to repave every street in the neighborhood twice. The financial hemorrhaging was bleeding the community dry while enriching Caldwell's firm. My building ownership revealed Caldwell's unprofessional behavior through complaints from other tenants, loud phone calls that carried through thin walls, client meetings that disrupted building peace, and parking violations that would make a Mettermaid weep with joy. The lease's professional conduct clauses had been violated more times than speed limits on an empty highway. Building management began formal documentation for lease termination while I reviewed every comma in Caldwell's rental agreement. Sarah contacted an investigative reporter who covered HOA corruption statewide, a woman who collected crooked board stories like baseball cards. Lawyer suing client, then getting evicted by same client? That's front-page gold, she said, practically purring with anticipation. Media nugget: local news loves David versus Goliath stories with clear villains. Providing documentation and exclusive access ensures favorable coverage. I provided background materials while maintaining anonymity until the climax moment. Sometimes the best reveal is saved for when cameras are rolling and audiences are watching. I visited Dad's grave on a Sunday morning that smelled like fresh flowers and determination. The morning dew on his headstone caught sunlight like tears of pride. I promised him this fight wasn't just about tools. It was about protecting our community from predators who fed on fear and legal intimidation. The final planning meeting took place in Sarah's office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal briefs stacked like fortifications. She was confident we'd not only destroy their HOA case, but potentially face criminal charges that would make headlines. "Jake," she said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfaction of a chess player seeing checkmate 5 moves ahead, "we're not just fighting a lawsuit anymore. We're dismantling a criminal enterprise disguised as community governance." The pieces were in place, the trap was set, and the hunters had become the hunted. Time to spring the snare and watch corrupt power crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. Dad would have loved seeing bullies get their comeuppance, served with legal papers and a side of poetic justice. Maggie's desperation hit like a cornered animal lashing out. She filed a formal complaint with the state contractor licensing board, claiming I was operating illegally without proper permits. Anonymous flyers appeared throughout the neighborhood overnight, like poisonous mushrooms after rain. Convicted criminal living among us, with my photo blown up like a wanted poster. Then, someone slashed my truck tires. The security cameras caught everything. A figure in dark clothing creeping around my driveway at 2 a.m, knife glinting under streetlights. The footage was clear enough to see Maggie's face when she looked directly at the camera, apparently forgetting that modern technology doesn't take coffee breaks. Legal nugget: criminal mischief charges require clear intent to damage property. Security footage showing deliberate vandalism provides ironclad evidence for prosecution. Meanwhile, Caldwell's building problems were multiplying faster than rabbits in springtime. The city inspector arrived for his code compliance check with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found violations in a daycare center. Unpermitted electrical work, fire code violations, ADA non-compliance. The list was longer than a grocery receipt during inflation. Caldwell received his 30-day notice to fix violations or face lease termination. Watching his confident swagger transform into nervous hand-wringing was more satisfying than finding a $20 bill in old jeans. The man who'd threatened me with deeper pockets suddenly looked like someone whose pockets had holes. I wasn't sitting idle during this escalation dance. Sarah filed criminal charges against Maggie: stalking, harassment, and destruction of property. The security footage made prosecutors grin like kids on Christmas morning. Clear evidence of systematic criminal behavior by someone in a position of authority. The class action lawsuit officially launched with 12 former homeowners joining as plaintiffs. Each had documented stories of selective enforcement, financial pressure, and forced sales that read like a manual for neighborhood terrorism. Legal nugget: class action status requires common harm affecting multiple parties. Similarly, individual grievances become powerful when they reveal systematic abuse patterns. Local news picked up the story faster than gossip at a church potluck. HOA president charged with criminal harassment made front-page headlines, complete with photos of Maggie hiding behind her curtains like a vampire avoiding sunlight. The news van parked outside her house became a permanent fixture, reporters knocking on doors like determined missionaries. My garage sale transformed into a neighborhood support rally, the smell of coffee and fresh donuts mixed with the satisfaction of community solidarity as 50 families gathered to share their HOA horror stories. It was like group therapy for people who'd been terrorized by tiny tyrants with clipboards. The HOA's insurance company canceled liability coverage due to pending lawsuits. Apparently, systematic criminal behavior voids coverage faster than a fraudulent claim. Emergency board meetings were called weekly, with homeowners demanding Maggie's resignation like protesters outside a corrupt mayor's office. Caldwell's building lease expired in 10 days with violations unresolved. My building manager posted the formal eviction notice on his law office door like a sheriff's foreclosure sign. The irony was so thick you could serve it at Thanksgiving dinner. Community momentum built like a freight train gathering steam. I organized a neighborhood meeting that drew over 50 families to the community center. Angry voices overlapped as decades of frustration finally found outlet. Stories of financial manipulation, selective enforcement, and intimidation tactics that would make mob bosses blush. The homeowners voted no confidence in the current HOA board and demanded new elections. Democracy in action smells like coffee and righteous anger mixed with the satisfaction of people reclaiming their power. Sarah served Caldwell with a subpoena for all HOA documents while he faced eviction from his own office. Talk about legal pressure from multiple directions. The man was getting squeezed tighter than a tube of toothpaste in desperate hands. I offered to delay his eviction in exchange for Caldwell's withdrawal from the HOA case. Negotiation nugget. Leverage works best when your opponent has limited options. Controlling essential resources creates powerful bargaining positions. Maggie's final meltdown was spectacular. Police arrived at my house, responding to her complaint about threatening behavior. Apparently, my existence constituted harassment in her twisted worldview. I showed officers the security footage proving no contact had occurred, and they recognized the pattern immediately. "Ma'am, this is your 6th false report this month," the officer told Maggie, with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a toddler. "Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor charge. Consider this your final warning." The neighborhood watched from windows and doorways as Maggie's white Lexus retreated like a beaten army, fleeing the battlefield. The woman who terrorized families with legal threats was now facing criminal prosecution herself. Sometimes justice arrives with handcuffs and sirens instead of gavels and paperwork. Maggie was about to learn that bullies eventually meet bigger bullies, and some of those bullies wear badges and carry the full weight of the law. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap was about to snap shut with the finality of a steel jaw catching prey. Caldwell's capitulation came faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. His law firm withdrew from representing the HOA, citing irreconcilable differences. Lawyers speak for, "We're jumping off this sinking ship before it takes us down too." The man who'd strutted into my garage with Italian leather shoes was now scrambling to find new office space in a market tighter than a pickle jar with a stripped lid. My building manager received applications from 3 different law firms wanting Caldwell's premium suite. Suddenly, being a landlord felt better than winning the lottery. Business nugget: market demand allows property owners to be selective about tenants. When you control scarce resources, you dictate terms rather than accepting them. Maggie's late-night break-in attempt was the final nail in her coffin. The security system triggered like a fireworks display, cameras capturing her fumbling with my garage door lock at 2 a.m. Police responded within minutes, finding her hiding in Mrs. Dorothy Walsh's bushes like a suburban commando gone rogue. The arrest for attempted burglary, trespassing, and violation of restraining order happened under streetlights that made the whole scene look like a low-budget crime drama. The scent of police cruiser exhaust mixed with cool night air as Maggie was led away in handcuffs, her pearl necklace catching reflections from the patrol car's flashing lights. The emergency homeowner meeting that followed was democracy in its purest form. 200 residents packed the community center like sardines with voting rights, and the unanimous decision came swift as summer lightning. Remove Maggie and Janet from board positions immediately. The new board was elected, with promises of covenant reform and financial transparency. They nominated me for president, but I declined faster than a dinner invitation from my ex-wife. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh accepted the nomination instead. Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who've been watching quietly from the sidelines, documenting everything. Criminal charges against Maggie piled up like autumn leaves. Prosecutor filed formal charges: stalking, harassment, burglary attempt, and false reporting. Sarah's civil case gained strength from the criminal convictions. Nothing supports harassment claims like actual criminal behavior. Legal nugget: criminal convictions provide powerful evidence in related civil cases. Guilty pleas in criminal court become nearly unbeatable evidence in civil proceedings. Local news coverage intensified when state media outlets picked up the story. Suburban HOA president's crime spree made headlines across 3 counties, turning Maggie into the poster child for everything wrong with unchecked authority. The HOA audit revealed financial irregularities that would make Bernie Madoff jealous. $300,000 in questionable expenses over 5 years, with Maggie's husband's company receiving numerous no-bid contracts. Property management fees had been inflated 400% above market rates. Apparently, collecting monthly fees and embezzling them required premium pricing. My research exposed systematic embezzlement that read like a textbook case for forensic accountants. Every transaction left breadcrumbs that led back to the same criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. Community healing began in earnest. The new HOA board suspended all covenant enforcement, pending complete review of policies and procedures. My garage became an unofficial community gathering space, with folding chairs between tool benches where neighbors shared stories and planned reforms. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh served homemade cookies that smelled like cinnamon and redemption, while we drafted new HOA bylaws that emphasized common sense over arbitrary power. The garage that had started this whole fight now symbolized neighborhood resistance against tyranny. The investigative reporter published her exposé, HOA Power Couple's $500 0-cents K-fraud scheme, detailed years of property manipulation, forced sales, and embezzlement with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation. My story was featured as an example of citizens fighting back against corruption. Media nugget. Public exposure often triggers regulatory investigations. News coverage can accomplish what individual complaints cannot. The class action suit expanded to 25 plaintiffs seeking damages exceeding $2 million. The HOA's new board voted to settle rather than defend Maggie's criminal actions, recognizing that fighting the indefensible only creates bigger legal bills. The settlement negotiations proceeded faster than a greased lightning bolt. The agreement included covenant reforms, financial restitution for affected homeowners, and legal fee recovery that would make ambulance chasers weep with envy. My personal case was dismissed with prejudice. The HOA officially admitted no violations had ever occurred. Caldwell's law practice crumbled like stale cookies. State bar sanctions for ethical violations led to suspended license and ruined reputation. The man who'd threatened me with deeper pockets discovered that stolen money disappears quickly when criminal prosecution freezes assets. Justice tasted sweeter than fresh honey from hives built on the graves of bullies. The garage door still creaked when I opened it each morning, but now, that familiar sound carried notes of victory instead of grief. Dad always said good tools deserved respect, but he never mentioned that sometimes the best tool for fighting corruption is patience combined with strategic thinking and just enough crazy to make your enemies underestimate you. The trap had snapped shut with the finality of steel jaws, and the predators who'd fed on community fear were now facing the consequences of their actions. The HOA annual meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning that smelled like coffee and long overdue justice. For the first time in 3 years, Maggie couldn't control the agenda from her throne of petty power. 300 residents packed the community center like spectators at a championship fight, local news cameras capturing every moment for posterity. I arrived early and set up Dad's restored workbench as a display. The same tools that had started this whole war now polished and organized like a museum exhibit. The buzz of angry conversations filled the room, years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Despite the restraining order, Maggie appeared with a new lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Her hands shook as she gripped the podium, pearl necklace trembling like wind chimes in a hurricane. "I'm the victim of a coordinated attack by a disgruntled homeowner," she declared, voice cracking like ice on a frozen pond. "Everything I did was to protect our property values and community standards." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. 300 people who'd lived under her tyranny for years weren't buying that particular brand of bullshit. And then it was my turn. I walked to the podium carrying a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse, feeling every eye in the room watching. The cameras rolled as I began calmly, voice steady as a carpenter's level. 3 years ago, Maggie Thornfield told me rules are rules. I held up the first document. Here are the rules she broke while enforcing fake ones on the rest of us. The large screen behind me lit up with evidence that made the audience gasp. Financial charts showing money flowing from HOA accounts to her husband's company like water through a broken dam. Photos of Maggie's own covenant violations, the unpermitted deck, oversized shed, and commercial signage that she'd somehow forgotten to enforce against herself. Embezzlement, I said, placing the first document on the podium. False advertising, another document. Criminal harassment, the stack grew. Conspiracy to defraud homeowners through systematic property manipulation. Legal nugget, public presentation of evidence creates permanent record. Live streaming and news coverage preserve testimony that can't be altered or denied later. The security footage played on the big screen like a crime documentary. Maggie, vandalizing my truck under streetlights, attempting to break into my garage, hiding in bushes like a suburban ninja gone wrong. The audience watched in stunned silence as their former HOA president revealed herself as nothing more than a common criminal. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh took the microphone with the dignity of someone who'd suffered in silence for 15 years. This woman destroyed families, stole money, and turned our neighborhood into a police state. Today we take our community back. Formal residents called in via video conference, faces appearing on screen to describe forced sales, harassment campaigns, and financial pressure that had driven them from homes they'd loved. Current homeowners shared stories of fear, intimidation, and the constant anxiety of living under arbitrary enforcement. The scent of emotion filled the community center, tears, anger, and determination mixing like ingredients in a recipe for justice. Sheriff's deputies served final papers while cameras rolled, criminal trial dates set for next month. An FBI representative announced federal investigation into mail fraud and racketeering charges that could put Maggie behind bars for years instead of months. Maggie's new lawyer whispered urgent advice about immediate departure, but the damage was done. Her heels clicked rapidly across the floor as she fled like a vampire escaping sunrise, white Lexus speeding away from the scene of her downfall. That's when I dropped the mic drop moment that would make headlines. "I have an announcement," I said, holding up building deeds that rustled like autumn leaves. I now own the office building where this all started. The same building where Caldwell threatened me with lawsuits is now under new management. The crowd erupted in applause that shook the walls. "Sometimes rules really are rules," I continued, producing Dad's restored hand plane from the workbench display. "And this tool stays in my garage where it belongs, along with every other piece of my father's legacy." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, 300 people recognizing victory over corruption with the enthusiasm of fans watching their team win the championship. The reporter conducted a live interview outside the community center while neighbors celebrated in the background. "This wasn't about tools or garages," I told the camera. "This was about protecting our community from predators who fed on fear and legal intimidation." I announced plans to convert the building into a non-prompted legal aid center providing free HOA dispute mediation. Community nugget: true victory means helping others facing similar challenges. Individual success becomes meaningful when it creates systematic change. The cameras captured everything: justice served with legal papers, community solidarity triumphing over individual tyranny, and one man's fight to honor his father's memory by protecting neighbors from bullies with badges and clipboards. Sometimes David doesn't just defeat Goliath, he buys Goliath's office building and turns it into a fortress for other Davids. Justice came with handcuffs and a gavel. Maggie pleaded guilty to stalking, harassment, and embezzlement charges, receiving 2 years probation, $50,000 in restitution, and 200 hours of community service. Her husband's property management license was revoked faster than a bad check bounces, and their business dissolved like sugar in rain. Caldwell faced state bar sanctions for ethical violations that ended his legal career permanently. The man who'd threatened me with deeper pockets discovered that stolen money disappears when prosecutors freeze assets, and professional licenses get shredded. The class action settlement reached $1.8 million paid to affected homeowners, money that came from the HOA's insurance rather than resident assessments. I received $75,000 personally plus legal fees, but the real victory was seeing 24 families get justice for years of harassment. Financial nugget: insurance often covers legal settlements, but not criminal penalties. Civil restitution gets paid while criminal fines come from personal assets. The new HOA board transformed Pinewood Estates into what it should have been from the beginning. Transparent governance replaced secret meetings. Quarterly financial reports replaced hidden expenses, and reasonable enforcement replaced arbitrary tyranny. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh was elected president with promises of common sense over paperwork, and she delivered, like a politician who actually kept campaign promises. My garage was featured in the neighborhood newsletter as an example of reasonable compliance. The same tools that had triggered this war now celebrated as community assets. The irony tasted sweeter than honey harvested from hives built on bullies' graves. I converted the building's top floor into a woodworking studio honoring Dad's memory, complete with his tools displayed in glass cases like museum pieces. Sunlight streamed through workshop windows, mixing with the scent of fresh sawdust and hope as I offered free carpentry classes to neighborhood kids. The Community Legal Center opened 6 months later, providing free HOA dispute mediation that resolved conflicts through conversation rather than courtroom combat. Sarah opened a satellite office, specializing in homeowner rights, and local law school students provided assistance for simple cases. Legal nugget: Many HOA disputes resolve through mediation rather than litigation. Neutral third parties can find solutions that benefit everyone while avoiding expensive legal battles. National news picked up the story as how one homeowner beat HOA corruption, generating calls from homeowners nationwide facing similar harassment. I referred cases to a growing network of attorneys who specialized in fighting HOA abuse, turning individual victory into systematic change. Advocacy nugget. Individual victories can inspire systemic change. Success stories provide roadmaps for others facing similar challenges. The garage door no longer creaks when I open it each morning. I finally fixed that hinge Dad never got around to repairing. The familiar sound of coffee brewing in the workshop mixes with wood shavings and the satisfaction of work well done, both in carpentry and justice. I realized this fight was never really about garage storage or tool collections. It was about standing up to bullies who hide behind authority, protecting communities from predators who feed on fear, and honoring the memory of a man who taught me that good tools deserve respect and good people deserve better. The building that anchored Maggie's revenge fantasies now serves families fighting similar battles. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor darker than midnight, but occasionally that humor serves justice with a side of poetic irony. I still get calls about other HOA corruption cases, and recently heard from an elderly veteran facing foreclosure over a flag display that violated some bureaucrats' interpretation of patriotic expression. But that's a story for another time, and another fight worth winning. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh still serves homemade cookies during community meetings, the scent of cinnamon mixing with the satisfaction of democracy restored. The neighborhood kids learning woodworking in Dad's restored workshop represent hope for a generation that won't tolerate bullies with badges or tyrants with clipboards. Dad always said good tools deserve respect, but he never mentioned that sometimes the best tool for fighting corruption is patience combined with strategic thinking and just enough crazy to make enemies underestimate you. Share your HOA nightmare in the comments. I read every single one, and forward the worst cases to attorneys who specialize in fighting these neighborhood dictators. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more David versus Goliath victories, where good people triumph over corrupt systems. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is success served ice cold, with legal papers and a side of poetic justice that makes bullies think twice before targeting their next victim.